Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the human rights of older persons in Australia. My name is Andrew Byrnes and I'm Emeritus Professor of Law at the University of New South Wales and a Research Associate at the Australian Human Rights Institute at UNSW. The Institute is delighted to be collaborating with the Human Rights Law Centre in the convening of this seminar. Many thanks to Daney Faddoul and his colleagues at the Centre, and to Kylie Smith and Drew Sheldrick of the Institute, and also to Dennis Fernandez of Streamgate for his technical support. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my deepest respects to their elders past and present. I also acknowledge that most of you are joining us from many different First Nations lands around this continent. This webinar brings together two important strands of advocacy around human rights in today's Australia. The first is the ongoing campaign for a Federal Charter of Rights, or Human Rights Act, thus far an elusive goal in the Australian context, but currently facing perhaps the most favourable political context that such campaigns have seen for some years. The Human Rights Law Centre has played a leading role in spearheading that campaign. And this seminar is the third in a series of webinars organised by the Human Rights Law Centre, focusing on the potential implications of a Human Rights Act for specific groups in our community. The second strand of advocacy is the international and national efforts to better recognise and respond to violations of the human rights of older persons, including by the adoption of a new UN convention on the subject. Many such violations were highlighted and exacerbated during the height of the COVID pandemic, still with us in its latest wave. However, these reflected existing patterns of ageism, age discrimination, and the denial of the human rights of older persons. They were in many respects nothing new. The challenges and potential in ensuring the application of general human rights norms to older persons have been seen recently in the aged care reform process, the recent proposals by the Australian Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Law Centre, and many others for a Federal Human Rights Act, and indeed in the current inquiry by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights into Australian Human Rights Framework. And they've also been seen in recent recommendations of the Disability Royal Commission. Today, our panel will be exploring some of the human rights issues that affect older persons, themselves an extremely diverse group, and we can only deal with some subgroups of older persons today, and how a human rights framework and a Federal Human Rights Act could be used to address those issues in policy making and make changes in the everyday lives of older people. I'll be asking each of our four panelists two rounds of questions. The first to identify the principal issues facing particular groups of older persons or older persons in general, and the second round asking them to identify what can be done to improve the protection and enjoyment of older persons' rights in Australia. Our first speaker is Corey Irlam, Deputy Chief Executive Officer of CODA Australia. Corey is responsible for government relations, advocacy and special projects, and previously worked on health and human rights for LGBTI people and in the corporate sector. Our second speaker is Baquero Geronimo, Chief Executive Officer of the Federation of Ethnic Community Councils of Australia. Marianne has previously led initiatives that connect policy, research and practice on ageing, health, gender, financial security, participation and community development in the East and Southeast Asian regions and in Australia. Our third speaker is Helen Dalley-Fisher, Convener of Equality Rights Alliance. Helen previously spent 10 years as a community legal solicitor, specialising in disability discrimination, tenancy and social security frontline legal service provision and law reform advocacy. And our final speaker is Daney Faddoul, Campaign Manager of the Human Rights Law Centre since 2020 and the linchpin of the current campaign. Daney previously worked at Get Up as a senior campaigner, then the political director, and before that in the trade union movement. So I'll move to those questions. If you in the audience or have any questions that you would like to ask the speakers, please place them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if time permits, I'll try to ask them. The panelists have about 3 minutes to answer each of their questions, and hopefully that will allow time for us at the end. And just, you will have seen on the screen that this webinar is being recorded for people to view later. Let's start with the questions. Corey, you're first up. Could you give us a brief overview of what you consider are the major problems that older Australians face in having their human rights respected today?
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks everybody for having me today. Look, I think the overarching challenge here is ageism. Okay. If we think about the very existence of a residential aged care system rather than an all ages long-term care system, this could be seen as a form of ageism. For example, aged care is one of the only institutions in Australia that isn't included in an OPCAT review, even though it's seen internationally as a form of detention. And that's a form of benevolent ageism, that it's okay to congregate older people into a specialised form of care. In the Universal Periodic Review Session 2 on Australia, the government said that, we don't really need an international convention on the rights of older people because we'll use existing mechanisms to be able to consider that. We don't need to have another international convention. And I can't imagine that ever being an acceptable excuse for any other population in the community. So again, perhaps a form of ageism that comes through. But just to analyse that, we saw in cycle one between 2008 and 2012, only 27 out of 21,954 recommendations, so 0.12%, just mention the existence of older seniors, elders, or anything like that. Now, I'm pleased to say that that had a 7-fold increase to 142 by 2021, but that's still only 0.39%. Across the world, 142 recommendations. That's not even one per country on issues that affect older people. So this concept that, older people have the power because they've been around for ages. And you know what? I'm happy to say some older people do, just like some middle-aged people do and some younger people do. There is power dynamic differences within each population group. But in feeding that narrative that an older person has the power, we actually forget about what I call the underbelly of aging. We forget about the 1 in 4 people who are living below the poverty line in Australia over the age of 65. When you use the 60% of mean wages that the European Union uses, we don't have an official poverty line here in Australia. We also have a very weak Age Discrimination Act in terms of enforceability, and it lacks intersectionality. We've been long talking about those things, and that perhaps we should revisit the idea of consolidating everything, particularly now that conservative journalists and religious groups are seeing the value in doing it despite fighting against it in 2012. So there's just some interesting framing things: ageism, aged care challenges, international convention, and a weak Age Discrimination Act locally.
Great. Thank you very much, Corey, for that overview and stressing sort of diversity of older people and their invisibility even now. I now turn actually to Helen Dalley-Fisher to ask you, picking up one aspect of that diversity, what are the major human rights issues that older people in Australia face in particular, or to a higher degree than older Australians in general? Helen.
Thanks, Andrew. And likewise, I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me today. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal land in Canberra. I'd like to follow on from Corey's comments because I think that one of the things that is a real feature of the way human rights manifest in the lives of everybody is that we see these intersecting loci of disadvantage that create increasingly vulnerable populations the more you examine the lives of individuals. And so to the ageism that Corey has already referenced, for older women, you can then add the intersection with sexism, which brings a whole lot of other factors into play. So those figures that Corey has given on poverty for older people then break down again to a significant proportion of those people actually being female for a number of reasons, but a primary one is that operating within an economic system that discriminates against women then leaves you vulnerable over the life course to having a retirement income that's inadequate to your needs. If you add to that then a longer life expectancy for women, you see more women at the tail end of their lives having inadequate resources to meet their needs. And so we see that intersecting between sexism, discrimination on the basis of gender, and discrimination on the basis of age starting to really bite in the everyday lives of older women. And we're seeing that really acutely at the moment. There's no question that large swathes of the population are experiencing a cost of living crunch at the moment, particularly around housing costs. We saw that start to come out for older women a lot earlier than it did for the rest of the population. So we've seen a big increase in the number of people facing housing stress and homelessness in the 2021 census. But in the 2016 census, it was older women who were increasing fastest in the figures on who's facing homelessness, because those women were facing the intersection between the external housing problems and the issues that we have with our economy discriminating against women. And so that group becomes particularly vulnerable to stress in the housing sector, because they just have less fat to rely on when the system gets stressed. So at the moment, we're looking at a range of issues emerging from that, in particular, the way we don't record the experience of homelessness particularly well. Lots of work's been done, particularly by the ABS, to try and improve that. But we still find that individual women don't characterise themselves as being homeless or experiencing housing stress, despite the fact that they're living in temporary accommodation with, for example, family members. They feel it's offensive to describe it as homelessness. And so we don't have a good sense of exactly how many women there are out there experiencing homelessness. So there's an extent to which even our data about these issues is being impacted by discrimination. The other one I'd just like to very briefly mention is healthcare, and the fact that older women are much more likely to be in residential care or be users of residential care than older men, partly because of the extended lifespan. The issues that we have and that we've seen coming out of the Royal Commission around consent and around types of treatment all apply to a larger group of women than they do to men.
Great, thank you very much, Helen. And now over to you, Marianne. What has your experience been of the major human rights issues that older women from migrant and multicultural communities are facing in Australia today?
Thank you, and
Thanks.
thank you so much for having me in this webinar. To follow on what Helen said earlier, I would say that the face of aging is women. We know that there are more women in the oldest old population, and this is not unique to Australia. This is a global phenomenon. And that's where, as Helen said earlier, it intersects with issue of sexism. And it takes a very particular challenge for women from multicultural or migrant backgrounds, because there is an assumed role for women in these communities to take on the role of a caregiver or a carer, as we would call it. And being in this role puts women in, a very abrupt kind of changes in terms of their labor force participation, because they have to fulfill at both ends, either caring for their children, but also caring for older people in their families. And because they would need flexibility in managing their time, in most cases, they would be in lowly paid jobs. And it's these particular problem of financial insecurity that puts women from migrant backgrounds in a lot of, in severe cases of abuse from family, because having no financial security, they lack the agency to defend themselves when they are faced in a situation, or they're in a situation of abuse. For example, leaving their families, for example, to be out of the situation will make them end up, homeless. And in these particular cultures, there is what we would call losing face when you are in that kind of situation. So actually, when you count total number of women who are in homeless situation, you don't really know the depth of that problem, because it's so hidden. There's so many of them who are in that situation. Just a case in point, for example, and we see this in growing numbers. We've seen grandmothers who came to Australia to take care of grandchildren. They're basically cooped up at home, no social connections outside of their own families, and they lived almost like in indentured labor. Family members keep their passports, they keep their own monies, presumably to help them manage their finances, because they don't have the ability to converse with people outside in English, or they have difficulty navigating the outside world, so to speak. So this is something that is really intersecting with our migration system and policies, which is really, really complicated, even for people who are very educated and can, navigate the system with fluent English. And in this situation, we create a situation for older women who have temporary visas to become more vulnerable because they can't defend themselves. They just are, basically isolated. And the other issue that I want to highlight is during the lockdowns and the height of the pandemic, many older persons, and many of them women in residential aged care facilities, as Helen said earlier, they have reverted to their own original language. And this is really, something that's coming up for older persons who have dementia. They're basically unable to receive their care because they're unable to express their needs because they can't speak in English, essentially. So this is a very extreme situation, but now that we are back in post-COVID world, we can see varying degrees of neglect because of older people's inability to access language support, for example, or even their inability to continue with religious or cultural practices. I must highlight that we would like to say that there are some covert racism that's also happening here because people have an inability to really understand culturally appropriate care, for example, and really understand the depth of some older women's situation, lacking that kind of visa that they would need to be able to really interact with the systems more effectively.
Great. Thank you very much, Marianne. And I think your both the previous contributions have underlined that ageism and age discrimination extend their tentacles beyond the obvious areas that we all talk about, and you've mentioned some of them there, so need to be addressed across a wide range of policy and legislative areas. Okay, so we've set some of the scenes with some of the problems, and now I'm going to throw to Daney, who's going to give us I hope, a more focused human rights analysis. What are the human rights issues or problems which the previous panelists have highlighted from your perspective?
Thanks for that.
Over to you, Daney. Yep.
Thanks for that, Andrew. And I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge sovereignty was never ceded. I think the first point to note is that everyone, regardless of their age, their background, their gender, whatever characteristics they have, should be able to see a doctor regardless of their bank balance, should be able to have a secure place to call home regardless of their postcode, should be able to have dignified treatment regardless of their particular circumstance or situation. Those are the sort of basic human rights that everyone in our community should be able to have. And what's more, we've promised the world that we would uphold those human rights standards here. We signed up to two conventions in particular, one on civil and political rights, and another one on economic, social and cultural rights. And those promises have not been fulfilled properly in our laws and in our policies in Australia. So we have a situation where we don't have those rights being upheld. And when that is the case, it's very difficult for people to take action when those rights are being breached, so they can do something about that. And the worst thing about it, I think, is the fact that we only hear about these problems when it gets to an absolute crisis point. Like we've seen with the Aged Care Royal Commission, things bubbled up to the point where a whole Royal Commission needed to be held, years of hearings and testimony to unpack all that situation, that terrible situation for aged care residents, too many of them who didn't have dignified treatment, who weren't able to access the right to health. And as a result, we now have that in black and white. And the worst thing about that, I think, is the fact that at its core, what they found was people's human rights were not being respected. And if there were enforceable human rights standards, that would make a massive difference to making sure those problems wouldn't happen in the first place, because you'd have better policies and better laws and better decisions and services. But more important, just as importantly, people can take action when those rights are not being respected by their aged care provider or by other parts of the aged care system. And that's just one example of what older people have to face when their human rights are not enforceable and aren't able to take action when those rights are being respected. But I think the most important thing about it is about the decision makers and what they're thinking about. What we see with all that is a consistent issue of people are not at the heart of the decisions that are being made. A whole bunch of factors are at play, rightly so. Cost, what does the community think? If it's political leaders we're talking about, what did we promise at the last election that we would do? All manner of things are at play in their decision-making and their thinking. And all that's fair. but not included in those considerations, guaranteed each and every time they're making a decision, each and every time they come with a proposal, is what are the human rights of the people that we're talking about, that we're providing that service for, that we're making those laws for. And as a consequence, we're not getting the best decisions as a result. We're not getting the best laws. And unfortunately, we're also not getting the best services for older persons, whether it's in the aged care system, whether it's in the broader healthcare system, whether it's regard to housing, and whether it's regard to other parts of our society. So ultimately, I think it's about making sure we have those human rights standards that we've already promised the world that we would uphold, made enforceable, so we can have better standards for everyone in our community.
Thanks very much, Danny. And it's good to emphasise, yes, that there's no shortage of standards. And you've mentioned some of them: Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 2 international covenants you mentioned, and of course the specific conventions that were alluded to earlier on elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, rights of the child, rights of persons with disabilities, and torture, and how those have been integrated into Australian law or not, I guess, is part of what you'll be talking about a bit later. And I think the importance of not just dealing with the symptoms, but getting in early, upstream, as the Human Rights Commission always calls it, into policy making, into the preventive approach is very important. And I'm now going to turn to each of you and ask you what steps you think should be taken in order to address some of the problems that you have identified. And I'll go in the same order once again. And that means you're first off the rank, Corey. What sort of improvements do you think are needed in order to better protect the enjoyment of human rights by diverse groups of older people in Australia?
Yes. So we're trying to amplify the voice of over 50s. That's about 9 million people in Australia. Probably more likely when people are talking about older people, they're thinking that 65 plus. That's about 4.4 million. But when we talk about aged care, particularly residential aged care, we're probably only talking about 1 million. When we talk about, say, over 80, sometimes 75, we talk about home care. So it's only for these older cohorts that Australia's actually talking about human rights protections by putting rights into the Aged Care Act. And we're only talking about it in the context of Commonwealth-funded aged care services. So not even the aged care services you pay for privately, not covering off in healthcare, not covering off in community care, not covering it off in how government departments like Services Australia interact with you. So we're narrowing it down just to the smallest minimum possible cohort that we're going to extend rights for in legislation. And ironically, because we don't have an international convention, they're going to do it under the umbrella of the International Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, because ageing, frailty is seen as a form of disability in its broadest definition. So the test for government in the next 6 months is going to be not just that they've reached around to this smallest population and given them some rights on a page, but are they actually going to have them enforceable? Is it going to have lip service, or is it going to have some teeth? Remembering, if we didn't have ageism and we had an enforceable charter, we wouldn't need separate aged care rights. We wouldn't need to be talking about poverty lines. We'd have a much more comprehensive structure. So I think it's good that we're going to develop some human rights that are relevant to older people, because even if it only happens to the first million of the oldest of the oldest, it's easy to start from something than nothing, to argue for how do we expand it beyond aged care, how do we include it for more than just people who have aged care age, how do we move that support for rights into an international convention. But my other one in the next term of government, I suspect, will be the consolidation of anti-discrimination laws. And I think that will be helpful for no longer having to choose, as Helen sort of alluded to, was I discriminated against because they were being sexist towards me, or was it because they were being ageist towards me? If you have one anti-discrimination law that can deal with that intersectionality, I think that will also help protect the rights for older people as well.
Great, thank you very much. And I think you raise a number of important points, but one which we haven't expressly touched on beforehand, that is, who are older people? Is it about a category of people, or is it about our approach to the aging process, which in some cases can kick in your 40s if you happen to be trying to find another job, but it's not necessarily chronologically determined by pension eligibility or aged care eligibility. It raises issues then about what form of protections we should have. And of course, our Age Discrimination Act currently covers discrimination on the basis of age at any age, although ineffectively, alas. Okay, we're doing very well, and people have been extraordinarily disciplined. So I'm hoping that we're going to see some questions appear in the Q&A soon. Okay, so over to you, Helen. What sort of improvements, legislative policy measures or others, would you like to see in order to bring about more effective protection and enjoyment of human rights by older women in Australia?
I think Corey's done a great job of naming some of the structural things that we could do. So what I would offer is an attitudinal shift, particularly among policymakers. For example, if you take the housing issue, at the moment we have policy that is developed both at state and federal level that starts from a basic proposition that housing is an investment opportunity. I would like to see a shift in the thinking to housing as a human right. And that you then make decisions about what the tax settings are, about what the allocation of resources are, based on the idea that everybody has a right to housing and everybody should have access to affordable housing that is appropriate. And so that involves a shift in the way that people who make policy decisions in Australia actually operate. I had a very memorable meeting with people from a health department, I won't name which one, where I was discussing their women's health strategy and asked them had they mapped that health strategy against the CEDAW requirements, so the requirements under the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And it was as though I'd stopped speaking English, the blank faces all the way around the table, because there was simply no concept that domestic policy in Australia should be designed with an eye to what it is that we've committed to do internationally. So it's not something that's in the current decision making in government, and I think that's deeply problematic. We've seen that then play out in other areas like the Sustainable Development Goals simply not getting a foothold in Australia in policy work because we don't have the framework for thinking internationally. Every year I go to the Commission on the Status of Women at the UN, and we spend 2 weeks negotiating a document of agreed conclusions, which is a human rights-based document in which Australia makes wonderful commitments. We're a really good ally of human rights in that environment. I have yet to see one of those documents referenced in any local policy that's ever been used in Australia. So there is a point where I think we need to get the structures in place, and hopefully one of the things the structures will do is start to change people's attitude about what the basic thinking should be when you develop policy in Australia about older people.
Great, thank you very much. Now I turn once again to Marianne. What sort of improvements are needed to improve the protection of human rights for older women from migrant and multicultural communities in Australia today?
Yeah, just linking to what Corey said earlier, and just to provide people context that at most, 1/3 of older people from migrant backgrounds receive aged care. That means vast majority of older persons do not have enforceable rights. So we're out of that whole category of, asserting our rights in particular. I'll just go back again to, understanding women's financial security. We believe it's very critical for policymakers to understand the implication of women's lack of old age financial security and how it impacts their vulnerability to human rights abuses. So there must be some policies that need to be developed in this area. Again, we are fighting for an Aged Care Act that is rights-based, but also broadly an overarching Human Rights Act is really going to be very critical, because we don't want to make a distinction between an older person, an older woman on temporary visa, or a permanent resident or a citizen. At the moment, the way aged care policies are kind of described, it's called policies for older Australians. And we have been fighting that it should be rephrased to say older people in Australia. That means you will not be discriminated if you are holding a temporary visa, and so on. And that means you cannot be discriminated on the basis of your race, ethnicity, religion, nationality, and so on and so forth. I think the key thing that I want to emphasize is the concept of human rights will be understood differently in different communities based on their experiences in their countries of origin. And many of them may not come from, contexts where there is human rights. So they might not understand what that means. So because of this, it is very important that we develop an education framework that is cohesive and very broad. And that includes the education system as well as community organizations. For FECA, it's very important that community touch points have the capability to help people from these backgrounds understand what is their rights, and that there are mechanisms for people when they experience abuse, they understand that there are mechanisms that will support them to take actions if their rights are violated.
Great, thank you very much. And just in case you haven't noticed it, there are a number of references and links to sources which are appearing in the chat, and we'll make sure they're repeated later, that may be useful, and I know Daney will be talking about some of them. And your trigger fingers on your keyboard seem to be working fairly slowly in terms of questions or queries or comments, so please get ready, because our panelists have been extraordinarily disciplined in keeping to time. But Daney, I'm going to throw to you a couple of questions, one which is unannounced, because but I'm sure you'll have no trouble with it, and that is, when we're perhaps before you jump into how a new Human Rights Act Charter of Rights might be of practical use, you might perhaps briefly remind us what the major elements are of the human rights legislation that you and others are supporting. Many people on this webinar would be familiar, but perhaps not everyone, and perhaps not everyone with the latest tweaks and ideas. Is that something you want to perhaps do now, or you can do later? And then I was going to ask you, what difference would that sort of Charter of Rights potentially make in relation to some of the problems that everyone has identified in the course of the discussion so far? It's a couple of questions. Over to you, Daney. You have more than 3 minutes, I think, if you need it.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Andrew. And thanks everyone for those excellent contributions. I actually want to start off by talking about what is the current human rights framework that we have that's enforceable in this country. So we have a couple of rights that are in the Constitution, like the right for compulsory acquisition of your property by the federal government must be done on just terms, as made famous by the Castle. A couple of those rights. We have discrimination acts, a whole series of them: age, disability, race, sex discrimination, which not just involves gender, but also sexual orientation, intersex status, and other series of attributes in that particular space. And then we've got like a few human rights here and there, which are more on the positive level. So, for example, you have a right to social welfare assistance under the Social Security laws. There's a whole bunch of conditions attached to that, but there's some rights there. There are some rights when it comes to criminal laws about how you should be treated if you're charged with an offence. There's some rights with respect to the right to vote in the Electoral Act, but also a bit of that in the Constitution too. So we've got this incredible patchwork of various human rights in various places. It's confusing, it's incomplete, in some cases it's even contradictory, but most importantly, a lot of it is difficult to enforce. And I think that's the critical thing for my mind. And as alluded to earlier, quite a bit of it doesn't necessarily come into the minds of decision makers when they're coming up with policies and decisions and views. So what we're actually looking for is a situation where we comprehensively have human rights protected in our laws, so that everyone across our community benefits from having those human rights standards that everyone across our community enjoys. And when that's not being enjoyed, there's something they can do about it. And that includes having a consolidated discrimination law in the federal arena that covers all the relevant attributes that we should be covering. Perhaps consistent process, consistent definitions to not just allow for intersectionality, so that if you're an older woman, you don't have to choose which discrimination act should I be looking at, but more importantly, the standards are consistently applied as well, and it's simpler to use. We also, though, need to have positive human rights in our laws as well. Somewhere where there is a right to health, the right to education, the right to dignified treatment, and all those other human rights standards that we've promised the world that we should be upholding. There should be a single place where you can go for all of those human rights that are listed, and for you to be able to take action when those rights are not being respected. But in my opinion, even more importantly, decision makers in the first place know about those rights and incorporate those rights from the very beginning of their process of coming up with laws and policies and services. So that, to my mind, is the human rights framework. One where we have like a strong, good, clear, consistent, easy to understand and enforce discrimination law that covers all the relevant attributes. And then a human rights charter or act that has all of those positive rights listed so that they're incorporated in government decision-making, in laws and policies and services, and then it gets implemented in reality. And if you're not having those rights respected, you can do something about it. There's a clear way you can know what those rights are and have those rights enforced. And so that's where a Charter of Human Rights comes into play. A Charter of Human Rights has those standards all listed and a mechanism for enforcement of it. Here comes the great news. We already have them operating in some states and territories. We have a Victorian Charter of Human Rights since 2006. We have a ACT Human Rights Act since 2004, and we have a Queensland Human Rights Act since 2019. And all three of them have some good, consistent standards and laws in terms of what they outline in terms of human rights. Here comes the great part. It's benefiting people right now. It's the quiet achiever. It doesn't make the front page, unfortunately, but it does make a meaningful difference in people's lives day in and day out. And here comes some of the examples for older persons. In Victoria, there was a woman who had a medical condition that meant she could have lost the use of her hand. Because of her age, the health system deprioritised her getting the medical treatment that she needed to deal with that medical condition regarding her hand. If she didn't get the urgent medical treatment, it was likely that she would actually have to lose her hand as the condition that she had degenerated further. Thanks to using the Victorian Charter, she was able to enforce her rights, and she got the urgent medical treatment, and she manages to keep the use of her hand as a result of that. In Queensland, the Human Rights Act was used for an older woman who was about to be evicted from her public housing that she was living in. She was able to use the rights that she had under the Queensland Human Rights Act to have that eviction reversed, because she was going to be evicted into homelessness. There wasn't a pathway for her to be able to have a secure place to go once she was evicted from that particular property. Those are the sorts of examples, those tangible examples of how positive human rights and a human rights charter can benefit people at the state and territory level. Obviously, we've got two problems with that. One is that's not every state and territory, it's only Queensland, ACT, and Victoria. But the more significant problem is we don't have one at the federal level. And so what we have instead is a situation where you have a Royal Commission, like the Aged Care Royal Commission, say we should have a new Aged Care Act. Recommendation 1 and 2 said there should be an enforceable right to health and dignified treatment, which of course is fantastic. That should happen. And I look forward to that coming through soon. But it only applies for aged care residents in the aged care system. It doesn't apply to aged care residents outside the aged care system, like say in the public hospital system. But shouldn't everyone have the right to health? Shouldn't everyone have the right to dignified treatment? That's something that should be a right that everyone should have. The Disability Royal Commission, similar story. So older persons who have a disability, the Disability Royal Commission, one of its main recommendations was for a Disability Rights Act, which is fantastic. And I'm looking forward to the federal government when they come up with their response to the Royal Commission, indicating that they're going to support that and implement that. But once again, it's a discrete set of rights for a discrete part of the population for discrete situations, when it should be applying across the board. So in my view, we need to be in that situation where we say, let's have a comprehensive solution so we don't have to wait for Royal Commissions and inquiries and investigations to take place to identify the problem and then come up with a discrete solution just for the issue that's being investigated by that commission or inquiry or investigation. Let's have the right standards across the board.
Right, great. Thanks, Danny. That gives us a really good overview, I think, that terrain. And I think it's probably fair to say that a Charter of Rights won't solve every problem, It will be part of a package of law and policy changes, but a really critical element of adding to what we've got that we don't have. We've got a number of questions which have come in, and there are a number. One there is on a COTA report, and Corey, I think that's going to come to you, but I might give you a minute or two to think about it, or at least do that. There's an important question which Cynthia Mulholland has asked, and perhaps we'll come to that at the end or a little bit later. That is, what can I as an individual do to assist in this matter? And I suppose it depends on what the matter is. Is it trying to get a charter? Yes. Is it trying to get a convention? Probably yes. Is it trying to get a Strong Aged Care Act? Probably yes. Is it trying to get coherent anti-discrimination laws which will do this? Yes. But obviously one has to push where it's most important at the moment. So perhaps each of the speakers can come to that towards the end. Then there are a couple of questions on the need for information and education and what to do about rights, or indeed the fact that often people don't think about what the injustices they're facing as rights issues, but often they don't think there's much they can do about it at all. So I'm going to throw to Marianne and Helen on that to start with, in terms of knowledge, information, capacity building, I guess, supporting people to realise that they are rights issues and that they may be able to do something about it. Perhaps Marianne, to start with, you want to?
Right, thank you. I guess that's one of the biggest advocacies we have at FECA, because there has been, in the early stages of so-called multiculturalism in Australia, there were a lot of support for communities to understand the Australian society, what policies there are to kind of, navigate the system. But I think, well, this year we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of multiculturalism, and yet you would see that there is, decrease in supporting, new and emerging communities. They are left to kind of fend for themselves. There's no support in kind of organizing themselves. So what I'm trying to say is the critical thing is for governments to look at these new and emerging communities and help them understand the systems, especially understand what their rights are when they arrive in the country. And there is a critical role for community organizations to play in this part. And so there are the ones that what we would call the touch points. There are the people that ordinary folks would meet every day. They would not dial any number, I would tell you, to say, what are my rights as a person living in Australia? They would be talking about these issues on the ground, and yet they would not find information unless there are people in communities who are already knowledgeable and being supported to share all this information.
Great, thank you. Helen, would you like to respond to that general question as well?
Yeah, and I would strongly endorse Marianne's view, particularly about the role of this being not just about what governments do, but also about how communities talk to each other. One of the things that struck me most strongly during the pandemic era was that we suddenly, for the first time in Australia, had a public level discourse happening in the media about human rights, and nobody had the language to do it properly. One of the things that would be great about a stronger human rights discussion in Australia is that it brings to our problems a whole range of solutions and tools that have already been worked on overseas. There's a whole culture and range of ideas about how you go about balancing rights when you have two rights that are competing and you can't implement both fully. How do you make the decision? What factors do you weigh up? What's important in that decision? And in the pandemic era, we saw an approach to rights that said, my rights are paramount. And that's particularly in the context of older people. That's was particularly acute in the COVID era, because old people were more likely to be in a scenario where they would suffer consequences from a COVID infection. Mortality rates were higher, the consequences were greater for older people across the board. And so, the question about what's my right to refuse medical treatment like vaccine being balanced against the right to life of older people was a discussion that we just weren't able to have in an intelligent manner. And so that problem that we've got about the fact that like the decision makers I was talking about earlier, we ourselves don't talk to each other about rights. We don't talk about, we don't frame our lives in terms of rights. And so one of the things I would urge people on this call to do is to think about rights in terms of your life. So that you've got some of that framing in your head and can then apply it to situations you come to. We're not encouraged to do that, but I think it's actually a really important thought exercise to go through to work out exactly what does a right look like when it's out in the wild. How do I identify it when it's galloping through the bushes, and how do I then work out how I can apply that to other people's lives. So I think that we need a community level discussion as well as a government implemented one.
Thanks. I think that's very important to think about that. And one thing which I think has struck various commentators on the pandemic is you never saw anyone in government referring to the JobKeeper scheme or other forms of support as giving effect to human rights, economic and social rights. And yet that's exactly what they were, and exactly the sort of thing that Australian community supports. So to suggest otherwise seems contrary to the facts. Okay, we've got a couple of very good questions coming in. Yumi Lee has asked what lessons can we learn from existing human rights acts. I mean, Daney has spoken to this to some extent, but others may also want to respond or supplement it. And then a big question from Anita Coles, which has two parts, which is, how do we actually change the culture, the practices of policy making, of public service attitudes and procedures? What could we do specifically? What can we learn? And Daney, you may have thoughts on that, but others may as well. But then specifically, Corey, or this may go to you, could aged care workers be governed by the Human Rights Act requirements, and would this work in practice, given the Human Rights Act normally covers public authorities and they're generally not public authorities? Okay, there are a number of big questions. Who wants to start? Corey, shall we go to you on the COJO report, the big question?
Yeah, sure. So look, I'm pleased to say since 2003, some 20 years later, we've actually got policymakers talking about grandparent carers in a way they weren't 2 decades ago. A recent report by the AHW showed a number of insights, and I think it's probably important to look at the concept of grandparent caring as everybody cares sometimes, but then there's a really small subset that provide intensive care. They essentially substitute and become the parent because the parent can't look after the child. And often when grandparent carer term is used, it could mean both. So I'm going to take it as the second cohort of just those smaller people. Services Australia now is much better working with people being able to access family tax benefit A and B and other entitlements like carers allowance when they're in that situation, which is good. So most of the issues raised in those 2003 reports have had some progress being done, certainly the visibility of it. But very happy if the person wants to email in their specific issues, and happy to take it offline. They have talked about DCJ, which I'm assuming is Department of Communities and Justice, which is a state issue. And if you're in Victoria, you'll be able to utilise the Victorian Charter of Human Rights in some ways. So probably a little bit more information will help us be able to answer it. I just want to go back to clarify something Danny said to make sure everybody's on the same page around aged care. We expect the aged care rights will include all people in aged care, not just residents, but also those getting in-home services as well. So yeah, just wanted to make sure everybody didn't think we were going to do half of aged care. But I think for me, for older people who, yes, they've got an Age Discrimination Act with very little teeth, the aged care human rights charter, statement of rights, whatever it's going to be, will really be the first time we actually think about the rights of older people in a comprehensive way, even though it will be limited for aged care. What's really interesting that's coming through is it's been almost half a decade more since the Law Reform Commission said we should change the way we treat substitute decision makers and change it from best interests of to the wishes and preferences of someone. So ironically, for the first time ever, the Aged Care Act might actually have a presumption that an older person can make a decision for themselves. It sounds crazy, But the way we write our laws when it comes to substitute decision making currently is, oh, that person can't look after themselves. And so we throw around this concept of capacity and this ability for somebody to make decisions as a very broad spectrum, from forgetting where you put your keys to somehow now you've got dementia, and that means you can't make any decisions for yourselves, and therefore you need a substitute decision maker who will decide what's in the best interest of you without even consulting with you. And if we can make that fundamental change in aged care to something that is actually that person can communicate, even though they might have dementia, about some decisions that they care about, we can operationalise the practical elements of human rights in aged care. That will be leaps and bounds ahead where we are now. So a really simple example, a friend of mine in disability care walked into a new home, provided the opportunity for the resident to either have an electric razor or a manual razor. Now, this is a pretty fundamental, simple, basic human rights of most men most mornings. I don't like to take an avail myself of it, of how you're going to become clean shaved. Believe it or not, that resident never was asked, broke down in tears. And I suspect if you go into any residential aged care home today, they're not offered the choice too when somebody's got dementia. So that fundamental concept of letting them point or indicate which one they want and being involved in their decisions is how we're going to be able to operationalise human rights. This isn't just some urethral conceptual when something's really bad. I think the other thing that's really coming through the discussion in aged care will be, and Helen sort of alluded to this, that concept of rights and responsibilities. And we don't really like that responsibility language because it sort of trumps human rights. We prefer to talk about how do we balance competing human rights, and being able to think in that residential group mentality of actually everybody's got human rights. So how do we support this person's human rights to watch MASH and that person's human right to watch Golden Girls, and how do we deal with the TV remote control conflict? That's a really simple concept of how do you balance those competing rights when you've only got one TV there. So I'm excited that by the time we come back in a year's time, we're going to be leaps and bounds ahead of the legal framework, but I suspect it'll be a couple of years of translating that into practice before I can say to you we've really got human rights in aged care. We can do it there, we can do it anywhere, I reckon.
Yep. Great, thanks very much, Corey. I think your understanding the offerings on available in aged care might be a little bit optimistic. My experience has been it's sort of Andre Rieu in Maastricht, or The Sound of Music on infinite loop, which underlines your point, I think. Okay, we've got about 3 minutes before I'm going to give everyone a chance for a 1 minute final comment, and perhaps they might want to focus in that comment on the question which came up earlier, that is, what can that is the people we're talking with and ourselves individually do to advance things. But I want to go back to the question of culture and changing culture in government and how we do that and what experience. I think, Danny, I think it's your turn to have a brief go, but then I'll go to anyone else who wants to talk on the culture of government issue. Danny.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think it boils down to this, which is when you have human rights standards that are enforceable, the culture changes because decision makers realize this is something I need to be applying. And if I don't apply it, there are consequences that will flow from that. So to give you some examples, the Royal Commission into Robo-Debt, it found that scheme was illegal and is illegal. What it also found was that the people who were relying on income support, their considerations, their needs, their priorities were nowhere to be found in the formulation of that scheme. And if there was that consideration of the people who rely on that system, for sustenance, to stay alive, to have a secure place to call home, if that was there, would we have ever gone down that entire dreadful path that hurt over 500,000 people who were caught up in the Robo-Debt scheme in one way or another? By contrast, in 2021, when the Victorian government was going to put in permanent laws to deal with how they dealt with the pandemic on an ongoing basis, when they proposed the laws they were going to put forward, there was a whole bunch of public debate about, wait a minute, there's a whole bunch of human rights standards you don't have in there, such as the ability for Department of Health officials to detain people on the presumption that they might infect people in the community. And shouldn't there be standards around how that is done? Because that's a pretty big power you're giving a public servant. who is not a police officer, who's not like got a structure for how they deal with things. And so as a result, there was a public debate, and that led to the eventual legislation being passed to cover the pandemic, having those human rights standards built into that legislation. And the big difference there was a Victorian charter that had provided the framework for that debate to happen. So it wasn't a case of people knocking on the door of Victorian government saying, can you please do better? It was like, actually, you have obligations here under the Victorian charter, and you need to factor that into the legislation. And it led to changes and a much more improved law that came from the Victorian Parliament at the end of that process.
Thanks,
so
Daney. Sorry, yep, please continue.
So those cultural changes, you can see those sorts of examples all in all manner of different places where they're enforceable.
Yep. And to emphasise your point, of course, at the Commonwealth level, we currently have a Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights that scrutinises legislation, at least, for conformity with the 7 core treaties we've ratified. Does a very good job, if I may say so, I haven't been associated with it, of the analysis, but it doesn't necessarily bring about the changes that we'd like to see, whether it's because it's too late in the process, in the political process, or because it's not backed by an enforceable right, as you're suggesting. Let's then go to perhaps the final round of questions, very brief responses, including, if you like, what can I do? But before that, I just mentioned one thing which I think is really important. It's the question of independent advocacy, and which is a critical part of the ability to realise rights that I think Helen and others were talking about early, and the important work that community legal services, including those focused on older people rights, do as an important component to make a Human Rights Act work, not just the Human Rights Commission and government. Okay, final round. Marianne, any final comments? What can I do, or what can I do,
what
are we not
or what
about?
can we do?
Yep.
Actually, there's more of changing the system in a way that there's an education that's really comprehensive, starting with really children going through understanding what is human rights. Because sometimes even the younger population are the ones teaching the older population who are migrants, because they're not understanding what kind of system we have here. So in that sense, we need to kind of broadly be participant to that ongoing conversation of what human rights means to us. And that could be a conversation that starts with a younger member of our family.
Great, excellent. Intergenerational solidarity and learning is the way to go. Helen.
I'd say for those of you on the webinar who are working in the policy space, use the language. So if you're making submissions, if you are making representations on behalf of a client, understand enough of the human rights framework to be able to invoke the right. Even though we don't have a federal act, we have signed those treaties. And the more we use the language towards decision makers, the more that language is not going to come as a surprise to them. And the more we can begin to build a culture around discussing rights in public. The other thing that I would suggest is one of the things that we do at ERA is map our work against the rights so that we understand that we're operating within those rights frameworks. And so we know, for example, if we're advocating a particular subject area, which rights are relevant to it. And then when we prepare a submission, we specifically invoke the relevant articles of the relevant treaties and the other documentation. And I think to make yourself familiar with the materials that are out there that make this easier, because the big thing about bringing all of that international experience and all that history of human rights into our system is that it simplifies a lot of stuff. We're plugging a lot of holes. So
thanks,
thanks,
Helen. Yep, sorry. 30 seconds, Corey, and then 30 seconds, Daney.
Sign up to Daney's Charter of Rights campaign. Sign up to CODA to talk about the aged care rights. And my challenge to most of you on here now is to stop ignoring older people in your work. Think about it when you're talking about CEDAW, or when you're thinking about a range of other things. Have you got more than a tokenistic one older person case study? How are you actually combating ageism in the work that you're doing as well?
Great. Thank you. Daney, 30 seconds.
Checks in the mail, Corey. So charterofrights.org.au, it has not just the one-on-one cases of those state and territory examples I mentioned earlier, plenty more. It's also got fact sheets. It's also got reports. It's also got a messaging guide. It's got all the resources you need to talk about human rights in a way that's effective, and also to get involved in the campaign to win this once-a-decade opportunity to win a Child of Human Rights.
Great, thanks. So lots of actions there. Write to your ministers, write to your local members, all ministers, not just the Attorney General or the Minister for Health. Charter of Rights, yes, with explicit reference to older people, I would also add, and we need a treaty too. So lots of ideas. I'd like to thank all the speakers for their contributions and suggestions and insights. And I'd also then just like to mention that we will be emailing a link to a recording to the webinar to everyone that you'll be able to share, and if you wish, revisit and pick up some of the references. So thank you all very much. Thanks to panelists, thanks to the organisers, and thank you all those who have attended this event. We look forward to meeting you in the struggle for older persons' human rights and human rights more generally again very soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone.